And thank you for joining us today for the PNAMP Remote Sensing Forum. If we haven't met, my name is Amy Poles, and I work for the USGS and the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership, or PNAMP for short. And as always, I'm joined by Lauren Burns.
Yeah, hi. As Amy said, I'm Lauren Burns, and I co-lead the forum with Amy, and we'll be facilitating today's meeting.
Right. Before we get started, just a couple of tips on navigating the Teams meeting platform. So we love to see and hear from you, but when you aren't speaking, please make sure your camera and microphone are off, and that'll help us keep things running smoothly. To do that, you use the icons on the Teams toolbar, and depending on the version of Teams that you're using, that toolbar might be fixed at the top right of your meeting window, or you might need to hover your mouse to get it to appear near the bottom middle of the meeting window. If you're on the phone, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. We invite you to use the chat at any time. We'll respond to technical issues the best we can, and we will circle back to questions for the speakers during the Q&A. And when we get to Q&A, we're also going to encourage you to ask questions out loud. So you can use the raise hand icon on the toolbar, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself. All right, so let's take a quick look at today's agenda. After I wrap up the welcome, we have just a couple of forum updates, and then after that, we'll have two presentations that we're very excited about on remote sensing data access and sharing. We'll have time for questions immediately following each presentation, and then at the end, we'll open it up for further questions and discussion if folks are interested. All right, so we're just really excited to have you all here today. We want this to be an open and welcoming environment and a harassment-free experience for everyone. So we ask that you just please be respectful in your interactions. And I think that's, good advice in most situations, and it is required here. On to the updates. So you may have noticed that it's been a while since our last webinar. We had to cancel the webinar last June, and unfortunately, we weren't able to reschedule it. And then almost all of my time got diverted to planning the Emerging Technologies Information Sessions Conference. And then Lauren took a new job. You want to talk about that for a sec?
I have an exciting update. I think maybe many of the community members already know, but in my previous position, I was a fisheries biologist with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission in Oregon. Since then, I've accepted a fisheries scientist position with Ecofish Research, and I now live and work in British Columbia, Canada.
Right. All right. So, but Lauren's settled in her new position. I've got my attention back on Remote Sensing Forum, and so we're back on track hosting quarterly webinars. And our next webinar is already scheduled for Wednesday, July 12th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific. The talks are going to focus on using remote sensing in wetland and estuarine environments. And I'll be sending the calendar invite and additional details for that probably in early May. All right, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is information sharing. So in all the communities of practice that I'm involved in, people want a way to communicate, to share information, to get advice from folks with more experience. So in an attempt to meet that need for the Remote Sensing Forum, we gave Microsoft Teams a try. And for several reasons, it's just not working great. And honestly, it's just really not being used. So we're proposing that we try something new, an email discussion group, which is not new technology, but is in theory easier. All right, so as the name implies, the sharing of information will happen via email. It's set up so that you email everyone in the group using a single email address. The purpose would be to share remote sensing events, newly published papers, or other interesting news about remote sensing technologies and methods. And it could also be used to ask questions to which group members can then respond. We are proposing to use Google Groups for this. It's free, well-established, easy to use, and has all the features that we're looking for. And as a member, it's easy to control how you receive group emails. So you can get each one individually as they're sent. You can get a single email each day that combines either the complete messages or summaries of the messages, or you can opt to not receive emails and instead log into the online Google Group interface, and you can read and send messages that way. You can use any email address you want to send and receive messages. It does not have to be a Gmail address. But if you want to access messages via that online Google Group interface, you will need a Google account to log in. So not a Gmail address, but a Google account. I just want to be clear that the email discussion Google Group is not replacing the remote sensing forum email distribution list. So the distribution list is something that I maintain and use to send calendar invites and emails that are specifically about the PNAMP remote sensing forum, the webinars and activities. The email discussion group would be for members to ask questions or share anything of interest related to remote sensing. So if we decide to use the Google Groups, I'll send an invite out and you will have to opt in. So in a second, I'm going to put up a poll to get your feedback on whether you think we should give Google Groups a try or not. But before we get to the poll, I just wanted to pause and see if there were any questions from you about what we're proposing to do. All right, I'm looking at the chat. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I'm not seeing any hands raised. Okay, so the poll. How should we share information? All right, so this is a Slido poll. I'm going to go ahead and throw a link in the chat that will take you to the poll, or you can use your phone app to scan the QR code, or you could go to slido.com and enter PNAMP RSF. All right, so we've got
That's
some
my
results.
response.
All right. Well, all right. No, we're
Sample
up to
size of
8.
one.
8
Oh, great.
responses.
Okay.
9 responses. All right. This so far is looking good. All right. Seems like people are willing to give Google Groups a try, which is exciting. Because I'm sad that Teams didn't really work out, but I understand why. I think if your workflow involves Teams and you're in there every day and you're part of DOI, it's very easy. But outside of that situation, it's actually quite difficult. All right. So I think thanks for the feedback, and I am gonna pass it over to Lauren.
Yeah, so just as a primer to today's talks, we thought that it would be useful to discuss reproducible research a little bit. I think many of us in the sciences are familiar with a diagram that looks similar to this, that talks about the components of collecting data and some of the challenges that you run into with sharing your data. So today's theme focuses on what happens after data has been collected, processed, and presented. Where your data ultimately ends up depends on many factors, as we know, including your internal data management plans. Today's presenters will describe some of the successes and challenges that an org may encounter along the way, and share some details to make it easier and more accessible to a broader audience. And some of you may know and be intimately familiar with data management plans and common standards and terms used to describe these processes, which leads us into our next polling question. Okay, so yeah, get your phones ready. A link will also be thrown into the chat. But our question to you is, do your remote sensing data comply with FAIR principles? As a reminder, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Yeah, and oh, that's surprising. Well, we have only 2 responses. So 1 fully comply, couple partially comply. Oh, we gotta answer change. Not sure. Data do not comply. Yeah, and like I said, there's a number of reasons why you might not be able to make your data accessible. There might be sharing restrictions, privacy restrictions. But I am a little surprised to see that, yeah, some people are saying that their data fully comply, because it's a difficult thing to do. And you have to really thoughtfully try to put a plan in place to establish fair principles for your data sharing. So thank you for everyone that answered and participated. Okay, and moving into our first presentation. So our first presenter is Dr. Sarah Hoffmann. Sarah holds a Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences from Clemson University and a Master's and PhD in Integrative Biology from Florida Atlantic University. As you may know, Sarah previously worked as a fisheries scientist with BioMark before it was acquired by Merck Animal Health. She currently leads the scientific marketing efforts in support of Merck's biopharmaceutical and technology portfolio for aquaculture, conservation, and fisheries. And today, Sarah will be presenting about the Smart Salmon Database, a collaborative platform for salmon habitat data sharing and insights. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about a lot of work that we've done over the past few years. And maybe first I'll point out that this is work that's been done by a lot of people. So I certainly want to give those teams the credit as we go through. So Richie Carmichael, who is on the call as well, he's been my partner in this. And maybe just as a little bit of a caveat, I'm not a salmon biologist and I am not an ecologist. So I'm sort of a token organismal biologist who saw a need for collaborative research in the work that I was doing on marine species, and was really excited about this project for data sharing. So what we are hoping to present today, or going to present today, is a project that we started on in 2019, I believe. Really looking at democratizing imagery data, and finding better avenues to share that imagery data, given some of the barriers that we've seen using drones and big data sets in general. And so maybe as a little bit of background, um, again, I started in the marine field primarily, so working with highly migratory species, and a lot of tagging and accelerometer data. And it's a very similar issue where the volume of data that you receive from an animal is incredibly large. And these animals are generally traveling across very large spatial scales and some geopolitical boundaries as well. So the collaborative research was really developing, I would say about 10 years ago. I was in South Florida, so along the Atlantic coast of the US. And we were really trying to figure out a way to better share these information and use those information, particularly in management decisions. So, at least from the telemetry side of things, my experience really came from working on these cooperative telemetry networks and sharing data through some platforms that we put up, and figuring out how to host big data, figuring out how to cite big data, figuring out how to make data accessible, really along the lines of those FAIR principles. So when we started talking about imagery, the Columbia River Basin, while a little bit smaller than these ocean critters, is also quite large in itself. So obviously we have 7 states and 1 Canadian province when we look at the distribution of Pacific salmonids throughout the Columbia River Basin. And there are so many organizations that are working towards one very unified effort, right, which would be salmon conservation or habitat restoration, any kind of environmental uplift in this area. So when we first started looking at this question, we were trying to think about what are the tools that go into making these management decisions, and how can we better centralize and standardize a lot of those data that are being collected in order to leverage all of the information that we have available. And there have been some really fantastic examples of that, and I'm really excited to hear Chris's talk after this, talking about OpenTopo. I think that was one of the one of the big platforms that we looked at when we started investigating this database. So I think, if we go back to on the ground surveys, CHAMP was an effort that that really brought forth this standardized protocol throughout the Columbia River Basin to start pulling in these same metrics, again, looking at that unified effort towards conservation. So we'll talk a little bit today about some analyses that we based on CHAMP data. Again, I'm really excited to hear Chris talk about OpenTopo and then even the tools that are available through PNAMP itself. So obviously there's a lot of people thinking about how do we leverage all of the information that we have for this resource, and we're just one other iteration of that and trying to centralize really specifically drone imagery in this case. So given those large spatial scales, highly migratory species, remote locations, expensive or hard to reach locations, there have been a really big use of drones in conservation biology and habitat management specifically. And that spans from environmental surveying. There's been some work, I've done a little bit of work using drones to evaluate kinematics and behavior. There's a lot of work coming out using drones to evaluate condition indices. I know that there are some people weighing seals with drones, which is very interesting. So generally, we see the utility of remote sensing for conservation. I don't think that's novel. And even in the salmon conservation field, obviously, this is a very cool GIF I found from Washington State looking at red distribution throughout a season. So again, there's a lot of information coming out on the utility of drones, but we're still figuring out the best way to implement them, manage the data, share the data, and make the most use of our resources in these monitoring fields. And so some of the work that was happening at Biomark before I joined was the development of the DASH protocol. So this, again, was led by Richie. I think I saw Toli Maki on the call, who was a big part of that development, as well as Mike Ackerman and Kevin C. So this was really, again, figuring out a standardized way to use drones to start creating these habitat surveys and turning those data into something that can be implemented on a broader scale. So in this particular instance, DASH is leveraging imagery that's collected by a drone, as well as a shortened on-the-ground survey. So the idea would be to expedite any of the on-the-ground variables that had to be collected, and then pairing those to the drone imagery to make those more easily spread across the region. And I think, when we started to work with the DASH protocol, we hit some of these barriers to entry that I think are fairly well documented throughout the conservation field. And again, I will say that these are very similar barriers that we had looking at something like accelerometer data as well, just given the size of the data and the ability to make big inferences from it. So one of the biggest barriers to entry that is fairly well documented for the use of drones is just the sheer volume of data. How do you store it? How do you open those files? Where do you even start with processing? And so there's been obviously a lot of attention on developing data science for resource management specifically, but there is still, it's very daunting to look at the size of the files that come out of those surveys. Additionally, especially considering a lot of the historic data that has been collected, again, thinking back to something like the CHAMP efforts, how do you then take data that are being derived from a drone image and relate that back to historic metrics or metrics that we know are associated with whatever our end target is. So the ability to analyze those images and translate them into a metric that we know how to work with from a resource management perspective is another one of those documented barriers. And along those lines, how do you then interpret that? So how do we, if you take a, drone-derived metric, do we know yet how that specifically relates to, in our case, we were looking at fish habitat capacity. So those are kind of the three areas that we started to think about. as far as tackling drones are great. You come up with this great data set. It's very granular, but how do we make that matter? How do we make that meaningful from the fish conservation perspective? And so that's where a lot of work went into analyzing those data and looking at capacity estimates. First, for example, is what the work that we were doing was focused on. And again, this was really work done by Kevin C., Mike Ackerman, and Richie Carmichael, leading this effort looking at specifically Chinook capacity in the Lemhi Valley. And we used some of those metrics from the CHAMP data sets in order to pair that to measured capacity throughout the years. And then that was an easier way to extrapolate that from the reach scale all the way up to the watershed scale. So this is a really effective tool to start making predictions about capacity in the face of something like a habitat restoration project. It was the first time we could really quantify what the potential uplift would be given a certain habitat restoration project based on these historic data. But again, that getting these on the ground data was a huge effort. So we wanted to transition into using drones in order to start collecting some of these metrics just from a resource allocation perspective. So those were really tackling the data analysis and translation and interpretation barriers. And then when we were thinking about the handling, storage, and processing issues, we moved in the direction of using some automated post-processing to pull out things like channel units, to pull out things like woody debris, some of these metrics that we knew were important based on those CHAMP data sets. But I think that it was about this point that we got to the realization that, one of the biggest barriers that we saw was just the ability to move these data around. If somebody in Oregon called us up and wanted some imagery from a site, just figuring out the best way to transfer that, shy of shipping external hard drives around. So we kind of backed up a little bit from this automated post-processing path. And we started to look at a standardized platform for data sharing that was as simple as knowing when and where imagery were collected in the Columbia River Basin and being able to share those imagery broadly with all of the collaborators in the region. And so that's when we started talking about a database for standardized habitat imagery data collection based around the DASH protocol that had been developed previously. So in this instance, we would have some standardized data input across a variety of variables, whether it be pit tag data collection, whether it be mark recapture data from electrofishing. We had those accelerated or expedited habitat surveys that were happening along with the drone imagery that was being collected, and then even potentially pulling in some satellite imagery looking at broader scale trends. So once we had this idea for something that would collect these standardized data, our goal was then to spatiotemporally reference those data and show them in a real-time viewer with some amount of storage and some amount of dissemination capacity. And then the end goal was to implement some of those automated post-processing tools into that database and hopefully deliver some analytical products to the end users. And so this was, I guess this was about 2019, 2020, and shortly thereafter, Biomark was acquired by Merck Animal Health, which is where we are now. And we had this opportunity come up to receive funding through the Merck Green Innovation Challenge. And Merck was really looking to fund a project that centered around our corporate responsibility to the environment and reducing our impact on the environment. And we were very fortunate to present this project really centering around the acceleration of a digital transformation in the way that these resources are monitored and managed. Again, focusing primarily on drone imagery here. And then again, also really shooting to foster collaborative research throughout the region. So, given the quality and density of work that's going into the Columbia River Basin, really centralizing those data and making them available for this greater unified goal. And then finally, from a Merck perspective, really highlighting our corporate responsibility to the communities and to the species that we interact with on a day-to-day basis here in the Columbia River Basin. So we were very fortunate to receive funding for this database, and I'm very excited to show you. That's what we're here today to do, is show you the progress that we've made on the database. And we also on the call have Eric Owens and Trevor Martin from Capstone IT, who did all of the development, and they've done just a fantastic job. So we're very excited to be here and hopefully get some use up and running. So if you would like to follow along, you can go to rivermapdb.com, or you can scan that QR code and it will bring you to a screen like this. So this is the home page if you don't have an account or not signed in. And it's a very simple user face. Again, basically what this database is doing is showing you where information is available and then parsing that data to wherever it needs to go. And we set up the structure. There are a number of different roles for these users, and we did this to make it scalable to broader adoption, really. So we have everything from an administrator who will determine who has what rights, and so on and so forth. So we have these different roles within a profile, and whoever the keeper of the users is can go in and change affiliations. And a lot of that had to do really around the flexibility that we wanted to afford around data privacy. So for example, if your organization was interested in displaying that you did have data in a region, but didn't necessarily want to share those data, as an example, outright, we wanted to have these different levels of authentication in order to afford a very flexible data privacy schedule. And so just going to show you the database. We'll do a little demo. Hopefully can you see a web browser, or are you still seeing a PowerPoint?
We can see the web browser.
Fantastic. Okay. So I am signed in. We used a couple demo sites here in Salmon. And what you're seeing, you can scroll around. We have, it's right now everything's centered into the US, but we're looking into geo-expanding that as well. But you can scroll into a region where you see these red dots, and that's showing you that there is a site available. And then if you scroll in even further, you'll notice that there's a bounding box around the site, and that's showing you the boundaries of the site itself. And those information are pulled from the data when it was uploaded. So those are pulled from the imagery or the EXIF files as they're dropped into the database and automatically populated. And then if you click onto a site, it'll give you some basic information about when it was collected, when it was uploaded, who the organization that owns the data are, and who was managing that particular site. And then you have the option to download a sample. And I won't do it because I don't want to crash my computer. But effectively what that will do is give me a sample of a TIFF image within this database. So again, it's a fairly blunt object. We have the ability, and this is what we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be an easy user interface where somebody could go in and see, hey, I have this one stretch of river that I'm interested in. Has anybody imaged it before? When was it last imaged? And how could I potentially access those files? So this is really the goal that we've set out to do. And again, in the face of increasing access to those data. And depending on your user role within that authentication process, you also have the ability to upload your data as well. So that's where we are at with the database right now. I think if we look back to the goal that we set out on, we have our standardized data inputs and we'll make those documents available as far as the data that we are looking for coming into the database. We have a real-time data viewer and storage system set up. And while we don't have automated processing to date, we do have some offline processing that can be uploaded into the database as well. So I guess one thing I should point out here is that you can upload the drone imagery, but you can also upload any of those analytical files as well. So anything that comes out of, let's say GIS, for example, that's really one package that we're trying to put in one place. So you can download the raw imagery and you can download any analytical products that are associated with it. So that's where we're at now. We're really at the beginning of the beta testing phase. And one of the reasons that we're very excited to be presenting here today is that we are looking for partners to start uploading imagery, poking around, seeing what features could make the experience better, seeing what features could improve the utility of the database. So please go join. It's totally free. It's free to free to register, free to upload data, and free to download data as well. So please reach out to us. We're excited to get this up and running, and we're excited to hear how we can improve on it. So thank you very much for having me. And I don't know if we're doing questions now or at the end, but happy to answer to the best of my ability.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really great presentation. It's so cool to see what you guys have developed over the past few years. I know I've been trying to follow this initiative since Richie had first mentioned it. And it's also really, really cool to see the evolution of data collection since the CHAMP days. I think Richie had his hand up in the chat, and we will take a couple minutes for Q&A. So Richie, if you just had anything you wanted to add, or if you wanted to pose a question to Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just real quick, something I wanted to add. There is inherent cost with any of this type of effort, especially long-term hosting. So I would just put it broadly out to the community and those in this forum. We are also seeking partners for long-term sustainability of this effort. We have acquired funding for roughly about a year of hosting and maintenance and small bug fixes, tweaks, and adding some utility to it, but we're certainly open and interested in any and all partnerships for long-term sustainability of this initiative.
Yeah, thanks for noting that, Richie. And I believe Eric Young also has their hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just about to ask that same question. And have you talked to the folks at NOAA's Big Data program about long-term storage?
To my knowledge, we have not. Richie, have you had any of those conversations?
No, I have not, but would love to talk with them for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, if you'd be willing to put us in contact with somebody, or if you have an idea of who would be the right person to talk to, I would really appreciate the point in the right direction.
Okay, Sarah and Richard, I'll contact you offline.
Fantastic, thank you.
Hey, does anyone else have questions for Sarah before I start asking some personal questions, because I've been interested in this? And don't feel shy. We'll also have another opportunity after our second presenter where folks can ask additional questions that might be related to either of the presentations. Eric, did you have another question?
Just a quick one. Is your vision that in terms of processing costs, usage of the data, that would be borne by the user? Or I'm just wondering what the downstream plan is once your funding runs out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's another reason that we had tiered levels of access. So I think in an ideal world, we would never have to charge for access. In the world where it costs money to upload and download and move data, that's less of an option. We have a general idea of what the annual hosting and maintenance costs will be. We would love to find an organization that would be that we could partner with to fund that outright so that everybody would have free access. Um, that's the vision, I think, for us.
All right, great. Thanks, thanks, Eric. Anyone else? If nobody else has questions, I just had a quick question about what happens on the back end and metadata and maybe tracking version and control and who, if anyone, has downloaded and edited. Since that is, yeah, the metadata aspect is like one of the critical pieces. And just making sure that, yeah, again, we have the best available data that can be shared with the community.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and something we're still building out. Right now, we have a protocol for the information that we would request along with the imagery if you are uploading imagery. So that's part of the Dash protocol that is publicly available. And then in the other section, the upload a result file, that's looking for, you can put anything into a zipped file and put it up there. So that was where we would look for any of those additional metadata that would be associated with that imagery. As far as versioning control, that's a good question. Right now we have everything by date. So at least we have the date itself won't change for the imagery, and you can have overlapping layers on the map. So for example, if we looked at that spot in the Lemhi, you could have imagery from the Lemhi from January 2020 and January 2021, and they would both show up. So that's where we are with versioning control. From an analytical products, we haven't gotten quite there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my standpoint, just being a spatial person and wanting to see things spatially, that's one of the strong suits of this dashboard, is being able to see that there are repeat surveys, repeat products available, and knowing what data you have to share. Because that can be a hurdle. Nobody wants to go digging through large file structures.
One thing we have implemented is a search feature. So that removes the spatial component, but you can go in and search through a couple of different parameters, whether it be the body of water that you're looking at, the state, the organization, or the date. So there is a way to at least search some of those key metrics from just like a listed point of view. And I think this is kind of the feedback that we're looking for, is what are the metrics that people are going to want to be able to parse data by?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm definitely going to sign up to be a beta tester, and I know that this
Fantastic.
is a common problem, at least that continues on into my new position here in Canada, and I think it'll be pretty useful for folks, obviously, in the Columbia River Basin. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think we will move on to our next presenter. And Sarah, if any other questions come into the chat for you specifically, we'll address those at the end. Full Q&A, but I encourage everybody to reach out to Sarah and or Richie about the Salmon dashboard in the future. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Great. So just we like to ask, again, live polling questions that might be helpful for our presenters prior to their presentations. So before our next presenter begins, please go to this QR code or the link that is in the chat and answer the question, have you ever used OpenTopography data or tools? 2 users. I've definitely heard of it, Chris. I will say that, but I haven't had the pleasure yet of getting to use it. All right, a couple people. Majority no, maybe, but just slightly, which isn't, altogether surprising, but gives you some context about who your audience is, at least.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Alrighty. So let's move on from this, and I'm going to introduce our final presenter for this meeting. Our final presenter is Chris Crosby. Chris has a background in geology, where his previous work has taken him across the US, the Caribbean, and to Central Asia. Chris has expertise in the management, processing, and distribution of light detection and ranging data, commonly called LiDAR, and joins us today to present on OpenTopography, enabling access to high-resolution topography data. So Chris, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see, can we see that? Hopefully we can. Is everybody seeing my screen in presentation mode? Okay, great, cool. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah, this is a nice follow-on, I think, to the previous presentation, talking about similar types of data from similar platforms in some cases, but maybe more of the focus on data access, but also on data usability. So I'm going to talk about OpenTopography at a relatively high level, which I think it seems like is appropriate for this audience based on the polling that we saw. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of things going on inside of OpenTopography. So if there's things you see me mention that we don't dive into, we can cover those things in the questions later. So maybe similar to the previous presentation, the goal here is really just democratizing access to this growing body of high resolution topographic data that's out there in the world. A lot of it's being collected by various government agencies, some is being collected by research communities, and these are really large, complicated, and interesting data sets with lots of utility. And OpenTopography has really been focused on how do we take these data, make them accessible online, but then also provide tools to make the use of the data easier. So instead of just delivering raw data products, we're actually delivering data as well as data processing services. So to put everybody on the same page about what kinds of technologies for collection of topographic data that we're talking about, this is a figure from a paper in 2014, actually, that talks about sort of the various contexts here. And so many of you who have worked with high resolution topographic data are probably familiar with airborne LiDAR, which is certainly the tool that's used most broadly for this kind of data collection. There's also, though, however, a terrestrial laser scanner. So this is putting a laser scanner instrument on a tripod and collecting very small site scale types of observations. In many cases, these are repeat multi-temporal data sets. In the world I come from, focused on sort of earth science and Earth surface processes and geomorphology. These are things like repeat surveys of landslides or features like that. And then on the right there are drones or other ways of collecting sort of site scale imagery from the air. So you could also hang a camera from a tethered helium balloon or a kite. Right now, most people are using drones, and this is what Sarah was talking about previously. So we're interested in data from all of these types of collection platforms, but then there's also other ways of collecting topography that are maybe not high resolution, but are sort of more global in scale. So these are things like laser altimeters, like the IceSat platforms. You can create very high resolution topography now from commercial imagery from sources like Planet and Maxar or other satellite constellations. And then there's like the kind of more traditional topographic data products that many of you may be familiar with, and things like the Shuttle Radar Topography mission, which is a radar system. So we're really interested in data from all these different types of platforms. And so before I talk a little bit more about OpenTopography, I'll just say a little bit more about us and where we come, how we got to where we are. OpenTopography was founded in 2009, and it's a collaboration between teams at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, which is a computing facility at the University of California, San Diego. EarthScope Consortium, which is where I work. This is a primarily National Science Foundation funded facility that supports geophysical research of all kinds for sort of the academic community. And then we have collaborators at Arizona State University. So the folks shown here are that this is the team. So it's a mix of sort of disciplinary kind of earth science domain experts, geospatial data experts, and software engineers. And we're heavily leveraging a lot of kind of compute infrastructure that's available through the San Diego Supercomputer Center. So some of the things I'm going to show you about on-demand computation of products is really possible because we're at an HPC center. We can leverage a bunch of infrastructure to make this possible. And importantly, our primary sponsor since 2009 has been the U.S. National Science Foundation, in particular the Earth Sciences Directorate. And we've sort of been on a 3 to 4 year recurring renewal process to keep this project funded. And I'll talk a little bit more about other partnerships, but NSF has really been our main supporter and has really funded the cyber infrastructure that I'm going to talk about. So what we do in simple form is data hosting and distribution of topographic data products in their rawest form, as well as derivatives and other types of data that might be collected at sort of similar time. So in the case of LiDAR data, this is point clouds, so like the raw XYZ laser bounces with their position and other attributes. Derivatives produced from those data sets, so things like digital elevation models, which might be bare earth terrain or digital surface to top of the canopy. In many cases, ortho imagery is collected either at the same time or nearly coincident. We have the ability to support those things. But then, as I said, that and then there are also these other larger data sets out there that are being collected through large governmental efforts, such as the USGS's 3D elevation program. And NOAA has a large catalog of coastal data and also inland waterways data sets. And those are also available now through OpenTopography through some kind of fancy federated data access that we've built in the last several years. And then the last thing that we've done a lot of over the years is education and training in the use of these kinds of data. So this is everything from webinars to in-person multi-day short courses, and also lots of online resources. And I'll talk a bit about that at the very end. And we've done this through a lot of partnerships. So we don't collect these kinds of data sets. They're collected by other organizations, primarily, as I said, governmental or research-oriented types of organizations. But OpenTopography has become one of the better platforms for distributing these data. And so we've been approached and built partnerships with lots of different groups, many of them in the United States, but also, for example, Land Information New Zealand is the national mapping agency, and they're collecting LiDAR over the whole of New Zealand in a program that's very similar to what the USGS is doing in the United States, and they've elected to use OpenTopography as their distribution platform for all of that point cloud data. So we push out a couple of like New Zealand data sets a month through that collaboration. People come to OpenTopography primarily for the data, and so this is like view of the lower 48 as of essentially today, showing coverage from high resolution topographic data. There's a color coding scheme here that I'll quickly mention. So the green is USGS's 3D elevation program. So this is the USGS's ambitious program to use airborne LiDAR to map all of the United States. That was roughly a 1 meter pixel resolution digital elevation product. NOAA's coastal data are in dark blue here, and these are data sets that NOAA is holding that essentially intersect the coastal regions and inland waterways. We provide access to those data. Data in red are data sets that OpenTopography is the primary archive for, so we're holding these data sets at San Diego Supercomputer Center. And then the little purple dots are data sets that community members have uploaded through our interface. So this would be a little bit similar to what was presented previous to my presentation here. So we have a mechanism for people to publish their sort of site-specific data sets if they might be UAV collected or other small-scale data sets. And then on top of this, so this is like there's 62 trillion individual XYZ measurements of the Earth's surface available through OpenTopography today, and this grows on a weekly basis. We also provide access to 13 different kind of global or regional topographic data sets. So these are lower resolution data, things like what you may have previously referred to as a national elevation data set in the United States. So that's like 10 and 30 meter topographic data products, but also things like SRTM, ALOS World 3D, Copernicus, the NASA DM. There's a whole suite of nearly global data sets at 30 meter resolution, and you can get a lot of those through OpenTopography as well. A quick look at the data. This is kind of just a fun series of images from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, because it's cool to look at. So on your left, for those of you who aren't super familiar with these kinds of data sets, this is a raw LiDAR point cloud. This is collected from an airborne laser scanner on an aircraft. And it's initially previous in this little loop, it was colored by elevation. So each point has an elevation, and that's the color scale is there. This image that's spinning now is actually laser reflectance. So the LiDAR scanners operate in the near infrared, and so each laser bounce has a reflectance, which is sort of measured into the albedo at that wavelength, and it's an attribute of the data set. There's also other attributes like how the points are classified. Such a ground point, is it a point from vegetation? So that's the raw data. That's the 62 trillion points there, that little animation. But what a lot of people actually want is a raster representation of that data set. So a digital elevation model or some derivative of a digital elevation model, such as slope or aspect. So that's in the middle. OpenTopography delivers those products as well as provides tools to make custom versions of that. And then on the far right are things like vector representations, like contour lines, which is a very classic way of looking at topography. And so we have tools to produce contour lines from data. So that's kind of like the spectrum of types of products, and then there's some higher order products, which I will talk about here in a second. Slides again, there we go. So here's the suite of kind of processing tools that live inside of OpenTopography, because again, the goal is to provide not just the ability to download some subset of those 62 trillion points, but actually to produce the thing you really actually want for your science, which probably isn't the raw points in many cases. And so we have tools for producing these raster representations and derivatives. We have tools for doing things like computing a canopy height, so that you know how tall are the trees in a given area. I mentioned contour lines, tools to look at the points in 3D. So that was what I showed you for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And then more recently, we moved into sort of higher order, more advanced processing capabilities. So in places where data sets overlap, we've developed a suite of tools to compute difference between data sets. So this is kind of cool, and you can do this in the vertical sense, just change in the Z direction of the landscape. And this is like works well in fluvial landscapes, but you can look at cut bar erosion and channel evolution and things like that. And you can do this all in a web browser. And then we have some more advanced tools for doing full 3D displacement calculations. I won't talk much about the difference in scope or tools inside of OpenTopography because that's a whole talk in itself. And then we also have some tools for doing hydrologic routing. And again, this is all running inside the browser. You can select a piece of topography and then calculate contributing area and other sort of hydrologic products through OpenTopography. So that's kind of like at the highest levels what's inside of OT. I'm not going to do a live demo, just because it takes a little more time. But this is kind of what the interface looks like. So it's a browsable map. It's free to use. You're welcome to go to opentopography.org and check this out. You make a selection of the map, and the system comes back and says, here are the available data sets. And they're organized into those collections that are kind of based on the colors that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So for this big selection over Oregon, there's 41 data sets in the OpenTopography collection, 60 in the USGS collection, 141 in the NOAA collection, and then there's a couple of data sets that have been uploaded by community members. So you pick the data set of interest, and you can see that there's, on the right-hand side here, there are options to kind of work with the point data, the raw data, or a kind of pre-computed raster digital elevation model type product. And so depending on your use case, you choose one of these. So I decided in this demo to go look at a data set that covers Mount Hood. And so here's a zoom in, I make a selection over Mount Hood. I can kind of parameterize the processing workflow that I want. So for that spatial subset of data, I'm interested in downloading some point cloud data. I may be interested in making a custom raster representation of that data at specific resolution and getting it out as in a specific file format. There's lots of different processing tools inside of OpenTopography. I won't go through each one in detail, but essentially you're building a workflow in the browser. And when you hit the submit button at the bottom of the page, we execute that workflow on compute resources at San Diego Supercenter or in the commercial cloud, produce those products and deliver them back to you and give you a results page that looks something like this. So this is a page that comes back. That specific job that I ran touched 213 million points and took a decent amount of time to run. Actually, this is a 1,361 second runtime. That's a decent wait. That's enough time to go get coffee and snack or something. But that's our goal, is to make jobs run relatively quickly, and to give you back just the products that you need. And then you can download and bring these into your GIS environment, or however you work with these data. Or we also make visualizations dynamically. So here's a bunch of, these are computed on the fly browse images of Mount Hood in different ways. So upper left is just a hillshade, the right is just color relief, bottom left is color relief merged with a hillshade, and lower right is a slope map. And again, these are all dynamically generated products that are free to download from OpenTopography. You can look at these in other ways. So here's Mount Hood kind of in 3D, and then another one of just Crater Lake, which in this case, we produce Google Earth KMZ files, and you can bring those into Google Earth and look at them really easily. So it's another simple pathway for interacting with these data sets. I mentioned the topographic differencing, and so I have this one slide basically on this. This is a more advanced set of tools, but as we get to the point where we have recurring collections of these kinds of high-resolution data, intercomparison is really interesting to look at all kinds of different processes. And so this is an example from White Sands, New Mexico, where there are actually 3 airborne LiDAR data sets inside of OpenTopography. And you can select a subset of one of them and then compare it to one of its overlapping peers, and produce a map of change. And so for White Sands, this is interesting because the wind direction is from the southwest, the dunes migrate to the northeast. And so in this difference map, which represents the January 2009 to September 2009 period, you can actually see sediment transport in the dune field. You can see that there's material being deposited on the northeast side of the dunes and eroded from the sort of southwest side. And so this is a really simple way to interact with these data. It's a really cool tool also for classroom teaching of various science processes. You can also compute 3D differences. This is a more complicated thing inside of OpenTopo. I won't talk much about this. People want to ask questions. Hydrologic routing is another suite of tools that we're running inside of OpenTopography. This took a tool called TAU-DEM, which was developed by David Tarbotton at Utah State University. Many of you may know that name. We took David's open source hydrologic routing toolkit and sort of optimized it to run on high performance compute infrastructure. And so now you can do full flow routing and DEM filling and the whole sort of workflow inside of OpenTopography through the browser. That's a really powerful thing. Pretty kind of cool technology demonstration. Talking a little bit more about the USGS and NOAA collections inside of OpenTopography. The USGS is the biggest player in the US in terms of collecting these data sets because the 3DEP program is really seeking to cover the whole US. I think we're at like 80-something% of the lower 48 has been flown. And I think the goal is to be done by 2025. These data are actually, because of the way that the USGS and NOAA operate, they're publishing these data currently into Amazon Web Services into what's called a public data set, which means that Amazon is actually covering the cost of the data hosting and the data egress. And so what we do when you go after any of the green or dark blue polygons in OpenTopography here, we dynamically go and reach into those buckets inside of Amazon and pluck the data out and then put the OpenTopo processing tools on top of it. So this is really cool because we don't have to hold the data. Amazon's actually offsetting the costs of holding the data. But we can provide our kind of value-added services on top of it. And one caveat about these data in particular is that currently it's so much data that providing on-demand compute on top of it is very resource intensive. And frankly, NSF has not funded us quite sufficiently to do this for the broader public. So right now, this is a resource that's limited to users with a .edu email address, which is the US academics, educators, students. And we also have a method for people to submit a request if they're an international researcher or student, not work in a nonprofit type of space. And we're working on sort of a business model to expand this value-added OpenTopography data access to these large catalogs. That's still an ongoing conversation about sort of overall sustainability of our system. Let's see. other thing I briefly wanted to mention, just in terms of what else is out there, are these global data sets. So for high resolution studies, like maybe what most of you are interested in, this might be less interesting, but actually we have many users who really like to get this kind of data from OpenTopography. These are these nearly global data sets, depending on the satellite constellation or the orbital system. They may not have true coverage, but in the case on the left, this is SRTM. And there's 30 and 90 meter data. On the right is the USGS's 10 meter data product. These are all accessible through OpenTopography. As I said, I think there's 13 or 14 kind of like global or regional data sets. And then, so we have that web browser that I showed you the quick screen captures of, the kind of GUI interface inside the browser, but that doesn't necessarily address every use case. And so there are definitely power users who want to access data in a more programmatic way. And so we've built an API that allows you to get data. So this is a very simple RESTful API. It's essentially just a string you can put into a browser or into a scripted like Python workflow. It's very fast, and it gets pounded by people from all over the world. Hit this thing constantly. I think there's something like 3.5 million jobs running against this API, which is quite impressive. And then we also provide all of the raster data inside of OpenTopography as cloud-optimized geotiffs. And so for those of you that think about these kinds of data, this is the sort of a cloud-native way of distributing TIFF data, which is very typical. And so there you can essentially use scripted processes to access the data that are sitting in our cloud buckets to pull data and process data. And we have a Jupyter notebook that sort of describes how to do this. If you're interested in that, I can point you towards that. A couple other basic things about OpenTopography that maybe come to the theme. One of the themes at the beginning of this meeting was to talk about sort of fair data. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to make these data fully fair. So every data set inside of OpenTopography gets a digital object identifier, so it's fully citable. Those of you who write papers know that most manuscripts get a DOI associated with this. These are DOIs for data sets, so they can be fully cited. We do our best to provide clear licensing terms for each data set, and also data set citation language, so you can copy paste into your paper, so that when you write your publication, you really should be citing the data you use. And then also just lots of linkages to additional metadata, so whether that's a PDF about the LiDAR data collection and how it was run, or other sorts of things. And then just quickly about OpenTopography and who uses it. So we started in 2009 with a handful of data sets when LiDAR was still a relatively new technology. The amount of data in OpenTopography has really exploded, but so has our user base. So there's something like 110,000 registered users of OpenTopography, 365,000 users of that API I was talking about. There's a massive mailing list of people who are interested in these data that subscribe to our mailing list. And importantly, because we're academically funded through the National Science Foundation, we're really focused on how we enable academic research and education. So we pay a lot of attention to publications, and so OpenTopos, as of the beginning of this year, enabled 746 different peer-reviewed publications. So this is places where people call out data they access through OpenTopography or data processing through OpenTopography. And this is one of the main motivators that keeps the National Science Foundation supporting what we do. And then just getting close to concluding here, education and training is another big part of the OpenTopography sort of like what we have done historically. We've done 35 in-person short courses on various ways to teach people how to process and utilize this kind of data. Our website's full of things like Jupyter notebooks and video tutorials and all kinds of other things that we are constantly working on to try to help people use our system or to use the data. If you're interested in this particular type of data and want a deeper dive on OpenTopography and various things OpenTopo does, or just more generally about LiDAR or other kind of photogrammetric types of data sets, we actually are in the middle of a spring webinar series. So once a week, we're doing a 1-hour webinar. There'll be 8 of them. And so you're welcome to go to the OpenTopography homepage. It's on the top of the page right now. Sign up for that, and all the webinars are being recorded and posted on YouTube. So if you can go back and watch them at your leisure. We also produce software and things. So this is a cool tool called the RiverRem package. It's designed to produce relative elevation topographic models for which I work really well in fluvial systems. And so this is essentially just a detrended elevation model, and they're really, really, really pretty to look at. And so I had an intern last summer named Kenny LaRue who wrote a whole Python package to kind of essentially automate the production of these things. People that make them do them sort of in a manual sense inside of a GIS package. But Kenny was super smart, sat down and figured out how to do this in an automated sense. You just feed this piece of Python code of DEM and it produces a REM with kind of pretty visualization outputs. So this is for people like you who work in fluvial environments. I encourage you to play with RiverRem. It's really, really cool. So that's sort of the high level kind of fast talk about OpenTopography, because there's a lot of things that we could spend like talk about for hours. And so I'm having to answer questions, but I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening inside of OpenTopography about enabling access to data, making data easier to use and find and fair, compliant. And also just a lot of really interesting applications for high-resolution topography, especially at national scale. So like when we start thinking about 1 meter pixel resolution topography for the whole United States, or maybe even repeat topography for the whole United States, there's a lot of really fascinating, interesting things that multi-temporal component really start to make possible. So I will stop there, and hopefully it's 25-ish minutes, roughly on time. If you're interested in more about OpenTopography, really interested to hear from users, people seeking new collaborations, new ideas. info@OpenTopography is kind of a go-to email address. We're on almost all the social media platforms as well at OpenTopography. So thank you very much. Stop.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris, for agreeing to present. Admittedly, I've been interested in OpenTopography for a while and haven't ever dedicated the time to sit down and take a deep dive into the tools. So selfishly, this was pretty helpful for me to have you come here and present for the forum. So I really appreciate it, and hoping it was helpful for everybody else. So I'll open the floor up for questions specifically related to Chris's presentations at the moment, and then we can open up the floor for additional questions for either presenter. Again, if you have a question, please use the instructions below to raise your hand to indicate that you have a question, or if you don't want to audibly speak, type it in the chat, and Amy or myself can relay that question to Chris. I do have a couple questions myself, of course, but I'll give it a couple seconds, see if anything comes in. All right, Richie, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Chris. That was really great. Not a question, more so just a plug for OpenTopography. I took an NSF Neon Open Topo workshop many years ago in grad school, and it honestly jump-started my geospatial career, and I just learned so much with the last tools and last lib library. So I just want to thank you and the team and just commend you guys for all the great work that you've done. And thank you again for presenting.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I mean, that's been actually one of the more rewarding things I've been working on OpenTopography since the founding, so I'm one of the founding principal investigators. And so we've done a lot of these training courses over the years, and it's really cool now to see somebody who came through one of those things 10 years ago as a graduate student or something, now professionally working with these data and writing papers or working with them in a sort of more applied sense. And there's a lot of resources in OpenTopography. Some of it's a little bit, sometimes we're constantly working on organization, but there's a lot of training resources from past short courses and things like that. And we're running actually a workshop in a couple of next month in Arizona. It's like a multi-day thing about sort of more advanced topics and processing data. So if you're looking for a tutorial or a how-to on something, you can't find it, like, feel free to send us an email on those at info@OpenTopography email address. We might be able to point towards something that is maybe not apparent because digging through this stuff is keeping this stuff organized on our website. It's kind of an ongoing challenge. So.
Yeah, I think with anybody, but yeah, thanks for highlighting that. We do have another question for you in the chat, and then so I'll read this over to you, and then we can open questions for both you and Sarah. So this one comes from Connor Stone. What would be the best way to contribute data sets to OpenTopography, and what baseline requirement do you have to contribute it, if any? I imagine there are some kind of standard contributors should strive to meet.
Yeah, great question. So this is a little bit of function of scale and size of the data set. So things like large scale collections from airborne laser scanners and things like that typically are still, in most cases, too large to sort of quite easily upload through a web interface. So those data sets typically are we encourage you to reach out to us and tell us about the data set. If you have metadata and descriptive information about the data set, we'd like to see that. And then those data sets we typically are able to ingest on sort of as resources allow basis. Data sets that are scientifically oriented or more sort of in Earth surface or Earth science writ large are typically more appropriate for us just because of our funding mechanism. We do have this thing we call the OpenTopography community data space, which I didn't really talk about. Probably should have put a slide in, but this is a system where you can drag and drop data through our portal and upload it to OpenTopography. This is appropriate for smaller scale data sets, kind of like what's presented in the first talk, these drone types of data sets, again, source imagery and derivative products from, say, a photogrammetric or photo produced topography. That system is suited to sort of smaller scale data sets. So if you've got data that are that size, you fill out a little application and tell us who you are, what data are. And then we have a template for metadata that we encourage you to use, but basically these data sets are a little more poorly curated generally. It's a little much more like the Wild West with some of these data sets in the sense that the quality of like the georeferencing and other things is not standardized, right? Whereas more typically airborne data sets, there's typically an RFP process and a QA/QC and validation process, and so those types of data sets typically are a little more consistent and well documented. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying it depends on the data and it depends on where it comes from. If it's a data set that's already part of one of these larger collections, like the USGS 3DEP program is really quite impressive and is a cost share partnership. So it's the feds partnered with state and local organizations. So it could be the data sets like that you're aware of are going to end up in that 3DEP collection eventually once they go through that process. And so, but if that's the case, they will end up in OpenTopography by default.
Yeah, thanks, Connor, for asking that question. He said perfect. That answers his question, so thank you. I agree. I had a couple similar questions that you kind of answered all at once there. And I do have another question that's kind of related to both you and Sarah's talks, which are about requesting data or like requests for an area that may not have the type of data or just may not have coverage. I know that's not the case as you showed with the USGS data sets, like we have near complete coverage of the US. But if you're looking for a specific data set that may not exist for a certain location or a specific type of data product, is there any way on OpenTopo or otherwise that you could file a request, like to search requests and maybe fulfill something that doesn't yet exist on OpenTopo?
I'll go first and then Sarah may have a different answer, but OpenTopography, we're a clearinghouse, right? We're not providing funding for data collection. We know a lot of groups, but the best mechanism for airborne LiDAR currently is to engage with the USGS's 3D elevation program process, where it is a cost share model. So local agencies partner and write a proposal. And so this is like getting to know your state, your other people interested in geospatial data in your state or your region. I think is one way to do that. Yeah, I think that's what I would recommend. And then the other thing, I'll try to find it and stick it in the chat. But there's this thing called the U.S. Interagency Elevation Inventory, which is we have it inside of OpenTopography, but it's maintained by NOAA and the USGS, and it's essentially an inventory of all known public elevation data in the U.S. And the fact that it's in the inventory doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy to access. It might be a data set that's sitting on a hard drive in somebody's office, but it's an inventory of metadata, and it's where I usually start. If somebody sends me an email that says, "Hey, I'm interested in data in this location," I usually go there, and so I just put that in the chat as a link. But it's another resource inside of OpenTopography that's a starting point for, like, is there data? You may have to, like, chase down Joe at some county GIS office and ask him to send you a copy on a hard drive, but at least you know that data is out there. And so that's another maybe long-winded answer to that question.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's, one of the biggest hurdles is figuring out, who has these historic data sets possibly that would be super helpful for your research or your work, and just finding the right person to contact. Sarah, did you have anything to add?
I think my answer would be the same. We're really just trying to show who is doing spatial data in what regions. So, I guess if it were me, I would go look and see, who might have flown a flight a couple transects down and get in touch with them. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is put people in touch with the right people, rather than parsing through requests for additional data ourselves through the database.
Awesome. Thank you both. All right. Are there, I have more questions. I can keep going, but I won't hold you guys on the line for too long. I'll ask another question unless we have some others from the chat. Again, feel free to chime in either by raising your hand or throwing a question into the chat. Give it a couple seconds. If not, I'll have another question. This is super useful for me. If nobody else is here, yeah. Okay, so the next question that I was hoping you guys could speak to was more so just about resources for helping orgs establish metadata standards. And, like, Sarah, I know you guys were working with developers to kind of build this, your tool on the back end, but are there resources, companies, folks in this community that could advise and kind of, spearhead some of the issues before they become issues down the line, because it does become cumbersome later.
Yeah, I guess I would say we're really reliant on the community to tell us what they find to be useful or not. I think that whenever you're looking at a large group of standardized data across many organizations and people, it's obviously going to differ. So our goal is to accommodate as much of that as we can, rather than try to dictate a standard, I think. So we're very focused on collaboration with stakeholders and adopting an approach that is generally agreed upon by groups like this one. So that's really the approach that we've been trying to take so far.
Yeah, I think I'd say similar, for these data sets that are inside of OpenTopography, things like the USGS's 3D elevation program have a very, very rigorous standard that any vendor collecting data needs to adhere to. And so for people who are producing similar kinds of data, I'd reference those, like, very well documented, well written, and common standards for that kind of thing. But generally, the community seems to be the place where a lot of this stuff gets hashed out, even though sometimes it's challenging. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Earth Science Information Partnership. It's a nonprofit organization, ESIP. They're typically a lot of big federal agencies and also academics play in this space. It's basically people who worry about geoinformatics or cyber infrastructure and all things related to it. But ESIP has working groups and the ability for community. It's meant to be kind of a catalyst for people to get together and talk about topics. And so ESIP has actually right now has a drone data working group where they're talking about things like standards for UAS collected data and systems. But it's like, if you're really interested in these topics, you might check out ESIP. They have meetings twice a year. One is virtual, and one is in person. And it's like kind of an interesting place for people who really want to get together and talk with people in other agencies and other organizations about these kinds of topics, whether it's standards or cloud technologies or those kinds of things. I put a link to these up in the chat as well. But their summer meeting is in Burlington, Vermont in July, I think.
All right. Thank you guys. Well, I'll offer it back to you. Is there any additional words of wisdom, pieces of advice, anything else that you wanted to follow up on before I turn the floor back over to Amy to discuss our upcoming meeting in July?
I think just a shameless plug on our end that we are really looking for feedback at this stage. So if you want to go use it, see if you can break it, see what does or doesn't work, we would really appreciate it. And again, Richie mentioned earlier, we are looking for long-term partnerships for that annual maintenance and hosting costs. And we have planned to make improvements all year. So as you find those bugs, yeah, we would just love to hear from you.
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm serious about it. Like, we welcome people like reaching out. So if you have questions, whether technical questions or other things you want to know more about something that I talked about, just send an email to info@OpenTopography, and somebody from our team will get back to you, hopefully relatively promptly.
All right, awesome. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. And Amy, I'll turn things back over to you.
All right, thanks, Lauren, and thanks so much, Sarah and Chris, for your excellent presentations. And for everybody who joined us today, we just appreciate everyone being here. I will send an email to the distribution list hopefully tomorrow with the link to the meeting recording. If you're not on the distribution list but want to be, send me an email. We hope to see you at our next webinar. If you have questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me and Lauren. And that's all I've got. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and enjoy the rest of your day.